We're going to discuss today the phenomenon of the Islamic State that swept out of Syria 14 months ago, occupies about a third of Syrian national territory, about a third of Iraq, went into Mosul, the second largest city, and took it over. Is now in two cities, Fallujah and Ramadi, that General Petraeus and his forces know well because they fought for those cities. This movement now has tentacles in West Africa, in South Asia, and throughout the Middle East. And the question before us is, how grave is this threat to the United States and to the countries of the Middle East, and what should we do about it? And we couldn't have a better panel, and I'll start with the person furthest away from me, and that's Bernard Haykel, Professor Bernard Haykel, Professor of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University, one of the foremost scholars of Islamic legal thought and Islamic political movements in the world today. He's going to be giving the Ernest May Memorial Lecture tomorrow morning as we start our Aspen Strategy Group meetings on this subject. He's going to try to give us a framework for how we might understand the role of the Islamic State in Islamic history. We have also with us Fran Townsend. Fran was Homeland Security Advisor to President George W. Bush, and she ran the Homeland Security Council at the White House, about the toughest job in the U.S. government in the years after 9/11, as we were involved in a worldwide struggle to protect our country and to protect our allies. And she's now a senior vice president at an advisory firm in Washington. She speaks widely throughout the United States and the world. We had the pleasure to speak together earlier this year. And then, of course, General David Petraeus, 37-year career in the United States Army, coalition commander of coalition forces in Iraq, commander of coalition forces in Afghanistan, and director of the Central Intelligence Agency, a man who has lived this struggle against the precursors of the Islamic State for the last 15 years. We are here under the aegis of the Aspen Strategy Group. We're a unique organization. Some of our members are in the front row: Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, our great friend, former member of Congress Jane Harman, now president of the Wilson Center, Professor Graham Allison of Harvard University, Anne Marie Slaughter, president and CEO of the New America Foundation. And I hope somewhere in this audience is Joe Nye, because 32 years ago, Professor Joe Nye and Brent Scowcroft created this nonpartisan group of Americans, people who had been in and out of government, and our job every year is to think through the toughest problems in American foreign policy, and there's none tougher than this one. So I also want to thank General Scowcroft for his extraordinary service to our country, and to Professor Nye for his as well. Welcome, everyone. So let's start with Bernie, with Professor Haykel. Bernie, before we get into the subject, what should the United States be doing to counter and hopefully defeat ISIS? In the long arc of Islamic history, and this is your field, where are the roots of ISIS? Where does it fit? Where does it come from?
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation and for being here. So ISIS, if you listen to what they say about themselves, they say that they're basically an exact replica of 7th century Islam. They are the authentic original Muslims. And the texts that they refer to, that they base their teachings on, are very canonical Islamic texts. They reject much of Islamic interpretation over the centuries. They feel that there's corruption that has seeped into the tradition. And so therefore they cherry pick individuals within the long arc of Islamic history to rely on. There's a particular individual in the 14th century who plays a very important role. And this individual was a Syrian who at the time had formulated a very strong condemnation of the Mongols. This was a group of people that had come from the East and had conquered much of the Eastern Islamic world. And so his condemnation of the Mongols is something that they replicate today to say the very same thing is happening now. We are being invaded again, but today it's not the Mongols, it's the West, and it's the puppets of the West, these different regimes that the West has created throughout the Arab and Islamic world, and we need to fight these regimes just like we then fought the Mongols. More proximately, their ideology comes straight out of Wahhabism or Salafism, out of Saudi Arabia's interpretation, which is a very strict, constructionist, very literalist approach to texts, and which is not shared by most Sunni Muslims. in fact, rejected.
Tell us, if you will, about Baghdadi, the charismatic leader of the Islamic State. When they went into Mosul in June of 2014, he made one of his only public appearances,
Right.
gave a sermon, speech
Yes.
from a mosque. How critical is he to this movement, and where did he come from?
So he's an Iraqi. He actually was a prisoner in Camp Bucca for a while. He is an Islamic legal scholar. He's studied Islamic law, and he's an expert on the recitations, the various forms of reciting the Quran, which is a technical subject. And he, in Camp Bucca, seems to have gotten very close to a number of other radicals, including former Ba'athist officers, and was able to indoctrinate them. He has taken on much of the Salafi positions of Saudi scholars going back to the 18th century. And in that famous sermon that he gave in Mosul, first, he spoke a flawless classical Arabic in an extemporaneous fashion. The other thing that he did is that he quoted the very first caliph of Islam, the very first successor of Muhammad, the prophet, and again, put on the garb of authenticity, claimed to be the very incarnation of this early Islamic period. So this claim to authenticity and to promising a utopia, this is the other aspect of the movement, is that it says, look, if only we could become like these early Muslims, just like the ISIS members. We follow their theology, we follow their practices. We can regain the power that we once had when we once conquered the world in the 7th and 8th centuries. So it's a promise of a utopia, and it's a fantasy. Now, if he was to be killed, I imagine he would be replaced by someone else. But it should be noted that this is a movement that comes out of Al-Qaeda to begin with. In fact, it was sent from Al-Qaeda in Iraq when they had lost their base to set up a state in Iraq, had actually been defeated in Iraq by General Petraeus and his men, and then resurrected itself largely as a result of the sectarian policies of the Maliki government, a government that took over Iraq from the mid-10s onwards, and then really ostracized the majority of Sunnis in Iraq, and as it were, pushed most Sunnis into this radical camp willy-nilly, and most actually did not want to be with this group.
Thank you very much. One of the things we'll be doing this weekend is to talk about American policy. How grave is this threat? What should we do about it? General John Allen, who is in charge of American policy against the Islamic State, will be with us. He'll be interviewed by Tom Friedman. And I would imagine some of the questions we want to ask General Allen are the two questions I want to ask Dave and Fran. First, how grave is this threat of a terrorist group with a big base in Syria, controlling most of northern Syria, most of western Iraq? How grave is that threat to the United States and its allies?
I think it's a very grave threat, and it's already demonstrated that it's a grave threat because individuals that were further radicalized, were trained in explosives and tactics and so forth in Syria, have gone back to countries in Europe and carried out attacks. And then you have this phenomenon of their effectiveness on the internet, where they have this singular ability to reach out to be found by people who almost self-recruit themselves and then are inspired to carry out the attacks that we've come to call lone wolf attacks, which are particularly worrisome because they're difficult to discover if you're in my old line of work or in law enforcement. So this is very significant, and of course it comes in a global context where there still is an Al-Qaeda, core Al-Qaeda threat that's out there. The most significant threat to the world, probably the U.S., is still the bomb maker Ibrahim al-Asiri in Yemen. He's Al-Qaeda, and so that threat's still out there. That would be more, back to the 9/11 kind of threat that is still much less likely because of the damage done to the senior leaders, but still present as well. So we have these two different groups that are threatening our allies and our homeland and completely disrupting this very important region.
Thank you. Fran, your thoughts?
So let me build on what Dave was saying. Look at the numbers, right? You've got a force in ISIS that we acknowledge to be in the neighborhood of 20,000. By the way, we ought to be asking the question, that's not a stagnant 20,000, right? So you know many have been killed. They've been able to replace them. What do we know about the threat here in the United States? Again, let's look at what has been said publicly by administration officials. Jim Comey, the director of the FBI, has acknowledged that they have active ISIS investigations in every one of the 50 states here. And John Carlin, the Assistant Attorney General of the National Security Division, acknowledged here in Aspen 2 weeks ago that there have been 50 ISIS-related arrests in the United States in the last 18 months. So we can't, I think we have a tendency when we see these horrific videos of the burning and the beheadings, this is an away problem. And to Dave's point, it's not an away problem. As long as they have territory that they can control, it's not an away problem because they have the internet. And let me just then address the internet problem. We need to understand that particularly in this fight, in a way that is qualitatively and quantitatively different than the fight that Dave and I know very well against Al-Qaeda, these guys use the internet as a battlefield, and we have to approach it as a battlefield where we are willing to engage them and to defeat them and deny them that battlefield, and we're not doing that very effectively.
Yeah, you know, I mean, all this takes place in a context here in the U.S. where someone can go to a gun show and without a background check buy an assault weapon such as we issue to our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, stock up on high-capacity magazines and ammunition, and then go out. And one of these days, one of these is going to be very, very significant. Touch wood so far. Most have been interdicted. Some certainly have been horrific. But the potential is there, and again, the numbers just keep growing. And I think that's what's scary in a world where they're so effective in the internet. But what Fran started to get at also is that as we look at the strategy to combat this, it's got to be comprehensive. It just can't be kinetic activities, military activities. It's got to be in the internet space. You have to confront them everywhere that they are. You have to do it all simultaneously. You can't do whack-a-mole. You have to whack all the moles all the time. And that includes in cyberspace. And, oh, by the way, in countries where there are lots of challenges, say Yemen or something like that, you're not going to solve those problems just by, again, kinetic activities. You're going to have to get into a much more, what we would call a comprehensive civil-military campaign.
Thanks to all of you. I want to now turn to the heart of the matter. And I imagine when we're going to be meeting over the next 3.5 days here in Aspen, the key issue is, what are we trying to achieve? So I'd like to ask Bernie and Fran and David the following question. The Obama administration says our policy is to defeat ISIS. But if you look at the policy, we don't have ground troops, we don't have special forces embedded with the Iraqi forces, we're using air power. It looks like a containment policy. Will we be able to contain them with the present resources? Should defeat be the better strategy? So Bernie, maybe starting with you, you know the group, you know these political movements. Is containment possible? Is defeat desirable?
Well, defeat is certainly desirable, although I don't quite know how you defeat an idea, an ideology, especially one that is incredibly appealing to millions, tens of millions of young, disenfranchised, unemployed, politically repressed, people in country after country after country of the Arab world. So that's a real challenge, and it's not one that we can take on solely or wholly ourselves. I think it is also the problem of Turkey, it's the problem of Saudi Arabia, it's the problem of the countries of the region, first and foremost, before it is our problem. And you have to remember that this is a group that kills mostly other Muslims. It has killed ISIS, I'm saying, very few, relatively speaking, Americans and Westerners. And it is largely attempting to create a territorial state, a non-bounded, no boundaries territory called the Caliphate. And it is prone itself to extremism. So for instance, yesterday, there was an explosion, a suicide attack in Saudi Arabia in a Sunni mosque of emergency service personnel in southern Saudi Arabia. This has really shocked the Saudis, just like the 2003 attacks of Al-Qaeda had shocked the Saudis when many Muslims had also been killed, then when they were fasting. So I think this is something that we need to think of as a Muslim problem, first and foremost, and one that we have to get other Muslims to do the heavy lifting in rather than us.
Fran.
Yeah, I mean, the significant thing about this bombing, this was the third mosque bombing in Saudi Arabia. The other two were in the eastern province, in the Shia province. And so it really is, I think, one of those cataclysmic events for them, in addition to the fact that it targeted sort of emergency service personnel. Look, I think that the containment strategy fails. I think we know that now. I think as we sit here on the stage, we see...
And that is the strategy that you see.
Yeah, I think that's the strategy we see that they've deployed thus far. And you have to really commit yourself. One, what is your objective? And you have to be clear about it, both for the military personnel involved, but for the execution, for the ability to deploy all instruments of national power, which is what Dave was referring to earlier, that's really required to be effective. And it's just not working, because we're seeing, we talked about the beginnings of the group starting in Iraq and Syria, but we now see it throughout the world, as you mentioned in the introduction. And so we see it in North Africa, we see it in Yemen, we see it in Afghanistan. Containment isn't working, it's not been contained. And so you have to decide you're going to commit the resources to really defeat it. I do agree with you. This is a fundamentally regional problem, but we can't, because as I said in my first remarks, it's not an away game for us. We have a strategic interest in there being stability in the region and there not being able to use the region to project power. And so I think while it requires the involvement of our Arab Sunni partners, they can't and won't do it without us and without our leadership. And we bring real capability to the game that doesn't exist in the region in a whole bunch of ways, military and intelligence.
Yeah, I mean, defeat is imperative. Again, containment's not enough. The fact that they could still control vast swaths of supposedly contained. How do you contain somebody who's propagating on the internet from that area? Clearly, they have to be brought under more pressure. And then, you know, based again on what I mentioned earlier, you've got to go after them wherever they are. It has to be comprehensive. Then you can start to look at individual countries and certainly region-wide. Obviously, it has to be a coalition. Obviously, it has to be, in many cases, led by Islamic countries and Islamic scholars and Islamic leaders. But, you know, then when you start to look at specifics, when you look at Iraq, for example, should there not be advisors at select brigade level as well as at the division levels? Where's the military headquarters in Baghdad? There's not a 3-star military headquarters. The Battle of Iraq is actually being run out of Kuwait. Now there's a great 3-star general who's headed over there. He was as a colonel during the surge. Actually, before the surge, he actually started what became known as the Anbar Awakening. His headquarters is going to take this over. He knows the imperative of a civil military effort in Baghdad. Remember, the front lines are important, and we can't lose another Ramadi, and you got to keep pushing them back and doing damage. But the center of gravity in Iraq is Baghdad, and it's Iraqi politics. And if you can't get more inclusive politics, you'll never have a sustainable situation in the country. You can look at Syria, talk about that. You can talk about Afghanistan. Why would we draw down in Afghanistan when ISIL is just starting to pop up there? Look at North Africa and so forth, the other areas that were mentioned. These don't have to be massive efforts. This doesn't have to be the Iraq surge again or anything like that. It does have to be, again, comprehensive, and it does have to involve the coalition to a degree which has been formed. That's one of the achievements, I think, of the administration, is to pull together the countries, including countries in the region.
Let's break this down a little bit and talk about the specifics of a U.S., Arab, European, African response to the problem. David, maybe I could ask you to talk about if you were in government today, what would you be advocating in terms of military force? And Fran, just to get you thinking about this, what would you, Fran, want us to do as kind of a coalition leader of in the intel, and Dave can talk about that too, obviously, but also combining our counterterrorism capacity worldwide, especially in drawing up their financial support. And Bernie, maybe most important, this is really a battle for the hearts and minds of the millennials in the Arab world, especially in the Sunni world. This is a battle for the heart of the Sunni world. If you were advising President Obama, what would you advise him? I think it'd be interesting for people just to hear from the three of you some specifics about what our country should do.
Well, again, let's go back to the mission. It always helps if you truly understand what it is you're trying to do. We've, I think, affirmed that you have to defeat. The president has said our policy is to defeat. I don't think we're deploying the resources that are necessary to defeat right now. If we just walk very quickly from east to west, if you look at Afghanistan, I think we clearly should be doing a reassessment of why it is we're trying to get down to zero there. We're at a modest number. The cost is not extraordinary. I think this year we've lost 1 soldier and 1 civilian. The Afghans are fighting and dying for their country very significantly. And we still need the platform to continue the so-called regional counterterrorism mission, because that's where al-Qaeda's senior leadership still resides, albeit tremendously diminished because of the actions that have been carried out against them. But to make sure that ISIS doesn't find a home there, again, I think that's worth supporting the president in that country. Iraq, I gave some specifics there. Clearly have to amp up more of the training effort, have got to get weapons and training directly to the Sunni Arabs with the acquiescence of Baghdad, the support to our Kurdish Peshmerga allies. Again, to come back to the importance of Baghdad and having a 3-star military commander that partners with the ambassador.
American military commander.
American military commander who can help with the development of this inclusiveness, working it obviously on the security side, the security services front, but also as a partner, as I sought to be with Ambassador Crocker during the surge, when none of us ever went and met the Prime Minister without the other. We might sit in a different chair, depending on whose meeting it was, and sometimes we actually switched chairs so the Prime Minister knew that the meeting had just changed in character, but that's the approach that has to be taken. Syria, look, regardless of what your objective is in Syria, and clearly defeat of ISIS has to be one of those, I don't care if you want to get to a negotiated settlement, a breakup, whatever it is, you've got to have a force that we can support, force ISIS to fight us, and ultimately change the battlefield dynamics sufficiently so that folks actually go to the negotiating table in a serious way. The only way to do that is to have a force that we can support on the battlefield, and that's not working. We're all up to 60 so far. We have to protect them against all comers, not just ISIS, but against if Bashar's forces come at them, if Jabhat al-Nusra comes at them. And so that clearly has to have much greater emphasis, because you're not going to get there, and that is, at the end of the day, still the capital of ISIS, if you will, in eastern Syria, and still the area, the caliphate, if you will, that they hold that is most significant. And then just walking your way over further into Sinai and North Africa, again, a number of additional steps there that we can do, generally with partners that are reasonably good, with the exception of Libya, which of course is in the midst of a civil war between different secularists in one case, Islamists in the other, but also tribal overlay and some other challenges. And that is a very difficult one, and one that's going to take a lot more effort as well.
Two quick follow-ups, Dave, then we'll go to Fran, if you don't mind. David Miliband is with us this weekend at the Strategy Group. He's the president of the International Rescue Committee. David's focused on the greatest humanitarian crisis in the world today. Yep. Half of Syria's population, 11 million people out of 22.4 million, are homeless. And this problem...
250,000 Syrians have been killed.
Right. And so the international community has not done enough to cope with that crisis. Right. We can all do more. So you have this overlay of trying to battle the most evil terrorist group in the world, and the greatest humanitarian crisis, maybe of our lifetime, is happening right now. How do you handle that?
Well, look, I think it's all begs for a sanctuary. And the beginnings of that in the
No-fly
north.
zones?
Well, if you say that nobody touches who's in here, they're not. If they go at them, they're going to take them down. And so it will be, in effect, a no-fly zone, whether you declare it or not, frankly. If you're serious about protecting that area, and now that Turkey is allowing us to use their bases and is engaged in this also, I think you have the prospects for the first time of that kind of approach. So you're not yet going after Bashar in the way of taking him down, because, frankly, we don't know what would follow him. And until you know that, until you have a little bit more resolution on what might ultimately occupy Damascus, I think you should be a bit cautious in how far you go in that regard. But clearly, for, again, humanitarian reasons and also for the force that we're trying to develop and support, they're going to have our protection, our guarantee that nobody is going to mess with them. And if they do, we'll do to those forces what we did to ISIS when it threatened the Syrian Kurds in Kobani.
Right, thank you very much. Fran, Colin Powell used to say, Secretary Colin Powell, when he was Secretary of State, after 9/11, the military is critical. But he thought even more critical. What can we do through intelligence, homeland security, judicial cooperation, economic cooperation to dry up the ability of these groups to fund themselves and to feed themselves? This is the arena where you worked for President George W. Bush. What should we now do in that arena against ISIS?
Sure. Let me say one thing about the humanitarian crisis that didn't get mentioned, and I'm sort of on I proselytize about this, because if you weren't persuaded by the gravity of the humanitarian aspect of the crisis, this is this group of refugees who are impoverished, they don't have adequate access to health care and food and medical treatment, that the bad guys, ISIS, will go to recruit the next generation. It's why General Ray Odierno says that this battle against ISIS will take 10 to 20 years to defeat them, because we aren't doing enough to stop the next generation from being recruited. So what do you do now? Look, there's plenty that we have done during General Petraeus' time at the CIA and before and since to build the capability of the intelligence services there. The good news about that is they have greater access and ability to insert themselves into ISIS and have sources, because the human intelligence is really what you need to understand their intentions. And so we have made investments there. We need to do more. We need to spend more. We need to be willing to transfer equipment and capability to them, both military and intelligence, that we have been of two minds about. So just this week, we stopped military equipment being transported to Bahrain that has been gone through the approval process, I think, twice, and been stopped because of human rights concerns. There is capability that the Saudis want that they cannot get from us. By the way, when they can't get it by American equipment that's recommended and used by American forces, they go to our European partners and buy it there. So it's not that they don't get it, but it creates a lack of communication between the Americans and our allies in the region. We worked very effectively against al-Qaeda using financial sanctions, and we need to do more. We see reports that ISIS is able to get access to oil revenues, extraordinary amounts of oil revenue, and that money can be tracked. We know how to do that, but that requires an international effort. We worked both independently as the United States to impose sanctions, but also through the UN. And there needs to be a very coordinated international effort, because doing it alone is not effective. I mean, you'll have some impact if the United States does it. It's more effective if you can track it through the various banks that it goes through. And so it's really disseminating, populating in terms of capability and intelligence, and then it's working with your allies to impose the sort of financial restrictions that begin to cut off their capability for weapons.
Right, just follow up quickly. We have made considerable progress over the last 2.5 or so years actually in building the intelligence structures and building the financial forensics task force. I mean, there's a reason why we were able to take out this guy who was the head of the finances for ISIS. That was an intelligence and military success. So now it's really building on that. I mean, we shouldn't have been surprised that if you start from scratch against an enemy, that it takes you a while to develop this. We're seeing it on the kinetic strikes every day as well. They're more and more and more. They're taking a bigger and bigger toll. But of course, developing the host nation partners that can then exploit that on the ground is obviously the next critical stage, and that comes back to inclusive politics. That'll be the key for sustaining it.
And Fran, one quick follow-up for you. President Erdogan, I should say, is now kind of on our side. And one of the problems, and you referenced it, is that the Islamic State has been pumping oil and transporting it across the Turkish border and selling it in the black market. can that border at least, if Erdogan's not going to actually support us through military action, can he shut down that border?
Well, he can, but as you allude to it, it's a question of will, right? And it's clear that Erdogan is trying, because of his own Islamic politics, is playing both sides of this. The question is, can we bring enough pressure on Erdogan with our allies to get him to do more to shut down the border?
Thank you.
I don't feel confident that we will, or he will.
Thank you. So, Bernie, I'm going to leave the toughest question for you, and that is, please.
Okay, I just want to, I'm slightly contrarian, and thank God I'm a tenured professor and I'm not running for office. I really don't think ISIS is a fundamental threat to the United States, and I think we need to think very clearly about what it is that our strategic interests are in the region. And if I could just outline what some of these are. This is going to sound really heartless and harsh and cynical. It is. I think maritime shipping is really important. Wars between states, stopping that is really important. The oil fields of the Gulf are really important to us. Israel is very important to us. But what happens in western Iraq and the Sunni areas and in eastern Syria is really not that important to us. I say this because I'm not actually convinced that the Iraqi government, which is a Shia-led government, is really interested in those areas itself. There's a lot of talk in Iraq that, to hell with these areas. There's no oil there anyway. And so why should we do this kind of fighting, especially since we've spilled so much blood and treasure already in these wars? So I think we have to define very clearly what is really important to us and where we're willing to allocate assets before we go in.
So, Bernie, before I ask you my really tough question, I want Fran and David to respond, because this is an interesting point of view.
Well, I'm also not up for tenure, and I'm not running for office, obviously. And that makes Fran echoes it. Look, Bernie, I agree with you in the sense that the threat of ISIS to the homeland is more, again, this lone wolf, blow up a mall, theater, shopping center.
Which we had before with Al-Qaeda.
We've had it with extremists of different nature as well. So it's not necessarily the take down the financial system or take down the World Trade Center. Having said that, and also that, well, they don't care about these areas. I keep very close ties with Iraqis, and they're very concerned that these areas will become permanent launch pads for extremist activity into Baghdad, into the southern part of the country. ISIS would like nothing more than to ignite a regional civil war. So beyond that which is being fought by proxies in Syria, they'd love to get it down in. The reason they're blowing up Shia mosques in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia is to try to foment that within the kingdom. So then imagine if you mentioned all these important areas of infrastructure. They've tried before to get down and to blow up different areas to cause the kind of dislocation in the energy industry. And there are some critical nodes that we know very, very well that if they could ever get in and blow these up, as they took over the Beji oil refinery and complex up in northern Iraq in a Sunni area, they could cause enormous disruption to a global energy market that for the first time has really lowered the price of gas here at home because of our great energy revolution.
Fran?
Look, I do think that as we look at them holding territory, the problem for us is, and I don't think we can ignore the possibility of the blowing up the malls and the one-offs, right? Because we've seen what happens when they get momentum, right? They get momentum, they get more recruits. It may start as a lone wolf problem, and if it gets momentum, that problem will grow inside the homeland. And so I think we've got to deal with it now. They've shown us in the region what they do with momentum. It's clear by this blowing up of the mosque in western Saudi Arabia, the Sunni mosque. The real goal for ISIS now in Saudi Arabia is Mecca and Medina. And that is why this is so critical. They've moved physically closer, they've attacked a Sunni mosque, they've made clear their intent, and that gets back to what are your interests in the region. We care about the infrastructure, we care about the shipping lanes, and we can't wait until those threats become any more manifest, as far as I'm concerned.
And you discredit the Saudi kingdom by going after these locations, and that could be really catastrophic for the region.
Yeah.
So Bernie, you can choose to respond to that, those questions, or...
No, I mean, I think this is exactly the conversation we ought to be having. Like, what is really important to us? Saudi Arabia is important to us. You know, we don't want ISIS there. And if they were ever to cross that border, and they're not very far in Anbar, we should take them out. That would be a red line. But I think we have to be really careful. Also because, you know, ISIS's ideology basically says that a raid against the world of Islam, against them, against Muslims, all Muslims, Sunni Muslims, are the Crusaders, that's the West, the Zionist Jews, that's Israel and all Jews, and then what they call the Safavids, or the Iranians, the Shiite Persians. And whenever we fully put our weight in with Iran, if we were ever to fight with the Republican Guard Corps against ISIS, it would be confirmation of their ideology. Do we want to confirm their ideology? Do we want to help with their recruitment? I think we have to be really careful, you know, who we fight with in this war, especially not to confirm what ISIS is saying about how the world works. And now in the Sunni world, in the Sunni Arab world, there's a widespread, it's not true, but it's a conspiracy that's believed that essentially the West has sided with Shiites in Iran and with minorities, and that there's this arc of minorities going from Iran with the Shiites of Iraq, the Shiites of Syria, the Shiites of Lebanon, and, if you please, Israel. So the Jews, the Israelis, the Shiites are all, and the Christians of the region, the few that are left, are all going to be in one major alliance against the majority Sunni Arabs. And they look to a series of events to confirm this conspiracy. So we invaded Iraq, we gave it to the Shiites. When Assad started using chemical weapons, we didn't bomb him. Now we're signing a nuclear deal with the Iranians. It's all for them confirmation of a worldview where they're victims and we're out to side with their enemies. I think we have to be careful and keep in mind that this is the worldview of the people in the region and not confirm it.
So we're going to actually get to Iran, and we're going to get to your questions. But my really tough question for you, Bernie, is this, before we get to Iran. It's what we discuss tomorrow in our group. How do you convince tens of thousands of young Sunni Arabs not to fight for the Islamic State? These are middle-class people, a lot of them. They're from our country, they're from Europe, they're from Arab states, they're from all over the world. That seems to me the root of the problem and the toughest part of it.
Right. Well, I mean, it's a very difficult question to answer. Firstly, because the recruits, the Western recruits to ISIS, do not conform to a single sociological profile. In other words, it's not just the poor Westerners. You have middle-class Westerners, you have rich Westerners, you have highly educated, not so well educated. You have people who are just recent converts. It's not clear what the psychological profile of a recruit is. In fact, there doesn't seem to be one, nor is there a sociological profile for the recruits. So it's very difficult to know what it is about these Westerners and what makes them go there. Now, the good thing about these Westerners going there is that they burn their passports the minute they arrive in the Islamic State. The Islamic State has a ritual. It's a rite of passage, and it serves two purposes. If you burn your passport, it means you can't leave, and they don't want you to leave, right? And it also means that you're symbolically committing to the caliphate. So once they burn their passports, they're very likely never to leave, and they're probably going to die there, which is a very good thing, I think. So I don't think we should worry terribly about these nuts who end up there. Now, the more worrying aspect, though, are the recruits from the Islamic world and from the Arab world. Large numbers of Tunisians, large numbers of Saudis, large numbers of Iraqis, of course, and Syrians. Why? Why are those people going there? And what can we do about them? Because there we're talking about tens of thousands of people, unlike the 2,000 Westerners or so who have joined up. And I'm not sure what we can do except to reform the politics of their countries, to make their governments more accountable, more transparent, better, less corrupt, all the rest of it, which is extremely hard to do. Which is why I come back to the issue that This is ultimately a local problem. It's not something that we can sort of wave a magic wand and say, get these young people to now believe in their governments. They're not going to.
So here's what we're going to do. We're going to, I'm going to ask the panel a question about Iran, and then we're going to go to questions, and we're not going to stop at 5, because Walter's going to let us go to 5:15, maybe even 5:20, because I think a lot of people will have questions. But I want to end on Iran because it's in the news. And I'd frame it this way, and maybe Dave, start with you, and then Fran, and then Bernie. The Iranians are trying to achieve a nuclear weapon, to have the capacity to have one. President Obama, Secretary Kerry have negotiated an agreement. The Congress is going to vote. It's going to be a big struggle for the president to, if he loses the first vote, which I think he will, to sustain his veto. Do you support the deal? And let me ask the second part of it too, because they go together. You and I have been talking about this. Iran is also striking into the heart of the Sunni world. In Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. It's a real problem. Is it possible to have a strategy to go forward with a nuclear deal, leading question, without a strategy to contain the Iranians? And what would that take? What would it look like? And could that possibly unite Democrats and Republicans? That second part of it, the containment of Iran long term.
Well, first of all, I haven't declared on the deal. I will as we get closer to Congress debating it. I recognize the virtues of the deal, the way it stops the plutonium path to the bomb. 90%, 95% of the low-enriched uranium's gone. All the 20% is gone. Dramatically reduces the number of centrifuges. Decent inspections regimes. There's some reservations about that. Concept for snapback, reservations about that. There are lots of reservations, though, beyond those, and those are captured in a letter by the Washington Institute study group that I've been part of. To the administration's credit, they have been very aggressive in engaging us. I mean, when Tony Blinken calls you and asks questions, the Undersecretary of State has reassured me that Qasem Soleimani, the Quds Force commander, will not have his sanctions by the U.S. lifted. It has nothing to do with what it says about sanctions on him because of the nuclear program. So gradually, some of this is actually being either clarified or resolved, although some will certainly go on into the implementation of the agreement. Beyond that, though, I think there are 3 critical elements that would most reassure me, and I think most reassure a lot of the other folks that are really looking at this seriously. The first is for the administration to echo very firmly what Ernie Moniz, Secretary of Energy, said in a hearing the other day, where he said that we will not allow the Iranians to have to enrich to weapons-grade uranium, period. We will stop them. That is critical. After 15 years, after everything. Yeah. So in other words, when everything is lifted, he said we will not allow that. That matters enormously. Nothing would be more reassuring to our ally in the Gulf states than to have that echoed and re-echoed, not in a provocative, not in a poke in the eye, but just a firm statement of policy that this administration believes would be carried through, because of course it will be the successor to the successor that will be at that 15-year mark. That is very important. Second, there has to be a more fully and clearly articulated, comprehensive regional strategy. This is a narrow deal. It's about the nuclear program. It does not address a whole host of other issues that are of enormous concern to the countries in the region, again, to Israel and our Gulf state partners in particular. And there is a sense of what Bernie said earlier, that we're in league with the Iranians. And I don't buy this, but again, there is this narrative that's out there. There's very tepid support after a lot of lobbying by the Gulf states themselves. And this, again, has to be a lot more than just opening, some of the security assistance and selling them some things that they've long wanted. It's got to be tying together air defenses. It's got to be real strategy. It's got to be diplomatic across the board. And I think that's very, very important. And you put your finger on that. If you're going to have this one deal, you've got to have the overarching contextual strategy as well. And then, frankly, related to that, I think we have to be realistic. We have to be measured in our assessment of what this might do for the U.S.-Iranian relationship. Look, I'm all for if Iran becomes a so-called status quo power instead of the revolutionary power that they are right now. They're not satisfied with the situation. They want to be the hegemon in the region. They want to preserve not just the Shia crescent that runs, as Bernie mentioned, from Damascus, or from Tehran through Baghdad, Damascus, and then down into southern Lebanon. They want to expand their control and their influence. Again, would be wonderful if all of a sudden the country were to transform and we could have a relationship with them that would be constructive. But I wouldn't plan on that. I wouldn't bet on it, and I certainly wouldn't make irrevocable strategies based on that. If it happens, fantastic. We should be ready for it. We should be ready to receive an open hand in return if it comes back this way. But again, I think we have to be measured about the realism of whether that can come to pass.
So hope's not a strategy.
Hope is not a strategy, no.
Yeah. Fran.
I think it's funny, I wanted desperately to answer your question for or against. And I think I can't, because what I would say to you is I want to like the deal, I want to support the deal, but I share not only Dave's reservations, I am deeply skeptical about snapback and the inspections regime. I don't like the access to conventional weapons in 5 and missile technology in 8. I don't like any of it. But what you might imagine, where you sit is where you stand. This is the single largest state sponsor of terror as we sit here. They're going to get access when you lift sanctions to $100 or $150 billion. We are delusional if we think that's going to the people of Iran. That's going to go, 1, to line the pockets of the regime, and 2, right, and 2, to sponsor Hezbollah, which is what they've been spending their money on.
Quds Force.
And the Quds Force, right. So, look, I don't like the deal. I want to see when we get closer what Congress says. Look, here's the other thing. To the extent, and I like Dave, look to when people talk about what can we expect this means for the relationship with Iran, the answer is ask yourself one question. Not only are they still the single largest state sponsor of terror, they're holding 3 Americans. One's an American journalist. If there was any good faith, I understand, look, from a strategic and a diplomatic point of view, I understand having kept the terms of the negotiation narrow. I may disagree with it, but I understand there's an argument to be made to having done it that way. But if the Iranians were acting in good faith, when that deal got signed and John Kerry got on the plane, while he was on the plane, unilaterally, they should have released the Americans they were holding as a sign of their good faith. And I think that's about all you need to know the Iranians' approach to this.
All right. I think that the best thing about this deal is that American diplomats and Iranian diplomats have, now sat together for many, many months, and we've gotten the measure of them, they've gotten the measure of us. The specifics of the deal are not, to my mind, convincing. I have to tell you something about Iran, and we have to be very clear-eyed and unsentimental when we talk about countries in this region. Iran is a caliphate, first and foremost. Its political system is exactly like that of ISIS, okay, in that the leader of Iran, the supreme leader of Iran, is a caliph. He does not speak just for Iran, he speaks for all Muslims. And if you believe in the doctrine of the guardianship of the jurist, which is the core doctrine of the Islamic Republic of Iran, that doctrine requires blind obedience to that supreme leader. If you don't obey him, you're sinning. Okay, so there's a theology here that many of us don't realize is fundamental to the nature of this regime. The other thing about this regime is that it has deliberately, from the very beginning, flaunted international law, taken our hostages, used non-state actors and proxies by design. Why do they spend billions of dollars in Syria? What is Syria to them? One should ask that question. The other thing about the regime that I think should be very important and understood is that when you listen to what they say, so how are we described? Aside from death to America and all the rest of it, which is perhaps just verbiage, they describe us as the source or the central force of arrogance in the world. They use the term arrogance to refer to us. This is a Quranic term. This is a term from the Quran. It's the way Pharaoh is described in the Quran. Pharaoh for Muslims was an unbeliever, a pagan. There is no way you can make a deal with Pharaoh if you're a Muslim. Okay, because you're dealing with an unbelieving system, an unbelieving person, and ultimately the believer must destroy the pagan. So the language, the theology in which he speaks to his own people ultimately treats us not just with contempt, I mean, it's beyond contempt. So I think we should be, very clear about the nature of this regime, and especially not just how it uses its language, but its non-state actors. Finally, they have killed more Americans than Al-Qaeda has in numbers. If you count Lockerbie, if you count the troops who were killed in Iraq and Lebanon. So, I mean, this is really a place that the way I would deal with this deal is that I would tie their actions in the region to the deal. In other words, if you send weapons to Yemen to support your proxies or to Lebanon, we would sink that ship and we would tie it to the deal.
And this is the comprehensive piece that I'm talking about. So you go back and look at Iraq, look at Syria, look at what we're doing, because in every one of these cases, look at Yemen, in every one of these cases, Iran is engaged, and in many cases, they're engaged in a nefarious manner.
So the panel is not warm to the deal.
We might get closer to it.
In a mercifully brief fashion, I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair and say I support it. And the reason is I support it is I detest the Iranian regime and everything they've done to our country for the last 35 years. I'm also mindful that there are enormous risks with this deal. But there's some benefits, and here are the primary benefits. They have been on a roll for 10 years. Ahmadinejad took office 10 years ago this month, August 5th, I believe, 2005. They've gone from a small nuclear program to a massive program. They've gone from being years away to 2 to 3 months away from a nuclear weapon. What this deal will do is arrest that forward movement. Freeze it.
Rolls it back.
Freeze it.
Yeah.
You're anticipating my next.
Okay.
Freeze it for 10 to
working with you
15.
here.
Thank you, General. Freeze it for 10 to 15 years, and instead of being 2 to 3 months away from a bomb, they'll be a year away from a bomb. These are unqualified benefits for us, and I am a hawk on Iran. I think this deal only makes sense if we establish a containment regime and push them back in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, places like that. I'd much rather try to contend with a non-nuclear armed Iran over the next 10 to 15 years than an Iran would certainly be a nuclear power without this deal. Last point. The critics, and I've testified 4 times in the last 3 weeks for my sins on this issue, I don't hear a logical, practical alternative to the president's policy. And until we hear it, I think it makes sense to go forward with the deal. So that was the prerogative of the chair. We're going to go to you now for questions. We've got 20 to 25 minutes. Walter will cut us off when he wants to bring down the tent. I don't actually see, we have mics, I believe, right here. So we'll go to the question nearest your mic. Who has a question on this side of the room? Anne-Marie Slaughter in the front row, member of the Aspen Strategy Group.
Thank you. So, Professor Haykel. Hi. One of the strongest arguments for defeat rather than contain ISIL is that they control territory, that they were able to declare the caliphate because they control territory. So the argument then is we have to actually take away that territory, otherwise we can't even contain them, that they will simply grow. And I want to know what you think about that claim, that if we were to knock them out of their territory, would that materially change their ability to do what they do?
Am I on? Yes. Okay, so I think it's not so much the question of territory that makes them so attractive and appealing to the recruits and to people in the region. It's the fact that they are winning spectacular victory after victory. So if you deny them that, even if they remain in territory, that is irrelevant. like Raqqa or, Western Iraq. But if they take cities like Mosul or they defeat the Iraqi army in Ramadi, that is what gives them momentum, and that's what gives their supporters the claim that, look, God is with them. That's why they're winning. So that's what you need to take away from them.
Let me echo that, because in this business, and I did fight folks like this for the better part of a decade, nothing succeeds for them like success. And remember that the populations in a lot of these areas have survived by almost chameleon-like tendencies. And those who are winning attract support. They're the heroes. And so they've got to be shown, in this case, to be losers. Beyond that, if you can start them losing, they're also then under much more pressure. And a lot of their ability to carry out what they do depends on freedom of action, access to communications. There's a whole series of elements that we used to chart out when we were going after Al-Qaeda in Iraq and say, this is what we must take away from them. Weapons, finances, sanctuary, ideology, command and control, territory, all of this, logistics. And if you can get them under pressure, as we have, by the way, and to this administration and the previous administration's credit, what we've done to Al-Qaeda's senior leadership in Western Pakistan dramatically reduced their ability to carry out another plan and then carry out another 9/11 attack. So again, if you can do that as well, I think then all to the good. Having said that, again, I'm very much with General Odierno and others who have said that this will be a decades-long problem at the very least.
Yeah, the other thing that you deny them, nobody joins a losing team. What do I mean? You deny them the recruits. And so you begin to take the oxygen out of the system, and it becomes a smaller and smaller, more manageable problem, which we found against Al-Qaeda.
You bet.
Yes, sir.
I agree with Bernie that this is essentially an Arab-Muslim problem, and that the United States can help these countries, but the Arabs themselves have to root out these groups. The problem is that now, in the last 30, 40 years, we've seen that these states have been hollowed out by Arab autocracy. One reason we have civil war in Libya and civil war in Syria and Iraq is breaking down is that these states have been hollowed out by Arab brutal regimes. And you don't have social cohesion, you have alienated minorities and whatnot. So essentially what you have to do now is to engage in state building, institution building, which includes what General Petraeus was talking about, the military aspect, the social aspect, the economic aspect. But this will take generations, not only 10 years, generations. And unless you embark on something as ambitious as what we've done in Europe after the Second World War, you have European partners, but also you have the Marshall Plan, nothing is going to be fundamentally changed. One final point. One reason Iran is extremely effective in mastering the art of proxy wars is that Iran alone in the region is capable of fighting Sunni Arabs with Shia Arabs. It is diabolical. It is extremely effective. The Iranians are not losing men. They are losing spending some money. But in terms of blood, it is Arab blood that is being shed by other Arab bloods. Whether the Houthis fighting the others in Yemen, whether Hezbollah saving the regime in Damascus, and by the way, it's Iran, not Russia, that saved the regime in Damascus. By Arab blood, Shia blood. And that's why, and there is no Sunni power, including Turkey, that has any power similar to Iran. That could really check the Iranian and force the regime to pay a price. And unless you do something about this, and it's extremely difficult because these regimes and these states and these societies are extremely divided. And we have to address this, and this is going to take a long time. And many of us in this country would like to see a quick fix. There ain't a quick fix.
Thank you. I couldn't see this gentleman because of the glare, but you just heard from the great Hisham Melhem, Al Arabiya correspondent. He'll be speaking to us tomorrow morning. Thank you, Hisham.
Let me. Shukran jazilan, Hisham. Look, I couldn't agree more with that. But what you emphasized was patient, thoughtful, careful, because yet another one of our Princeton colleagues, Bernard Lewis, very presciently used to say that democracy in the Middle East is strong medicine. It should be taken small doses at a time. And arguably that was validated by the Arab Spring, for which we all had such great hopes. but of course which resulted in much of the disorder and instability that followed in the wake, with maybe one exception, that being Tunisia.
Thank you. I was privileged yesterday afternoon to hear two of the great scholars of the Washington Institute talk about the pros and cons of this. One of the great dangers they emphasized is that Iran will always push the limits, meaning they will step over the line. We did nothing about Syria when they stepped over the chemical lines, and the dangers of us not containing them when they don't remove X number of centrifuges. Are we going to build a coalition, the US and their partners in Europe, that says if you do this, we will bomb you and take those out? If you do something else, we will retaliate. I'm wondering.
Well, that, I mean, again, that's one of the reservations that I have. I actually think some of this can be addressed. And as I said, nothing could be more important than echoing what Ernie Moniz said, that should they try to enrich to weapons grade, we will stop them.
One of the aspects of the debate that speaks to your question is that if you look at the debate on Capitol Hill, the Republican Party is united against the deal. The whole drama of the next 6 weeks will be, what will the Democrats do? But what I've observed over the last several weeks is really what you spoke about. I think Republicans and Democrats unify on Capitol Hill, and I think this panel would as well, if we say that President Obama and all future presidents for the life of this deal should absolutely be willing to use military force if Iran gets close to a nuclear weapon. I do find unity on that, and that's perhaps a very thin silver lining in the debate. But Fran, if you, Bernie, want to comment on that.
Well, but you've got we were talking about this before we came out on stage. We can't get agreement on the authorization for the use of military force in Iraq where we have people, right? And so if there is a bipartisan agreement, I think it would be an incredibly powerful leverage and tool to have out there. I mean, look, to go to Hashem's point, to do a Marshall Plan, it has to be not just a now strategy, but a decades-long, a long-term strategy that is funded and is consistent across multiple administrations. And I mean, I would like to think we are capable of doing that again, but I think that sort of a commitment on behalf, led by the United States and her allies, is exactly what the region needs to see and hear to believe that we are not picking sides in what has become a Shia-Sunni, civil war.
Good. Yes, sir, right here.
Thank you very much. I understand, and I would be happy to be corrected, that the other members of our negotiating group, Russia, China, and the European powers, basically told us not long ago that they're going forward with this deal to the extent they can, even if we do not. Now, I don't know if that's true, but what it suggests to me is that the only way we can make this work, actually, is the more integrated, holistic approach that you suggest. We're trapped now because the sanctions regime is going to erode. We're going to be left in a terrible place if the Congress doesn't ultimately allow the president to go forward with this deal. But there's no long-term way out without the grander strategy that is being discussed, and there's no way of doing that without the cooperation of the other major powers that have been negotiating with us. Now that leads to a final question. Russia and China. I share this wonderful dream of an Arab Renaissance with support from all of the major countries in the United Nations. You think that dream is shared by Russia and China?
I wonder if, Peter, do you want to talk about the same subject, the Iran deal? Okay, so let's take, this is Bill Nitza, who's a great negotiator, a lot of experience. What do you think of his question about the Russians and Chinese?
First of all, I thought you stated the situation in which we find ourselves very, very effectively, clearly, and with enormous nuance, and that is the challenge that we face. I mean, if this were to now blow up, so you can see where I might be headed on this as well, but along the way, let's get as much clarification as we can on these issues about which there are reservations. Let's get perhaps some reassurances, even with those allies. Again, until this is finally dealt with by Congress, I think there's still leverage out there and still possibilities. But, you know, look, Russia, the idea that Russia would support if we then blow the deal up and go back to a sanctions regime, and likely that China would not also, I think you're absolutely spot on. And it'd be very, very difficult to hold the coalition together.
Let's pass the microphone down this third row to Peter Fever of Duke University. And as the microphone goes down, I'd say one of the problems with the no-deal scenario, walking away and leaving this deal, if we leave unilaterally, I think it'd be extraordinarily difficult to hold the coalition together and hold the sanctions regime together.
Yeah,
But Peter's going to rebut me, so.
It's how you get to no deal. You know, there is a path to no deal if everybody united,
But not
I don't see that path as being realistic. So you're exactly
Yeah.
right.
Peter Fever.
So I want to rise in defense of the Obama administration.
This is a first. He's never done this before. So hold on.
Not on the
Get this
Iran
with the
deal.
cameras here, please.
Yes, not on the Iran deal, but on the reason that we have an under-resourced economy of force regional strategy. I think the administration would say, if they were being candid, that the American people don't want to go back in. They feel like they've tried the other thing for a decade and it hasn't worked out. So they would prefer, the American people, the president might say, just doesn't want a more robust engagement in the Middle East. Moreover, they would say, after you all came in to brief you in the Oval on the ISIL threat, the next group is briefing on the South China Sea threat, and after them is the group that's briefing on the Ukraine threat and the collapse of Mexico and so on and so on. And so the president would say, I've got to balance across all these. There's no political will for American leading the way we've led a decade ago, and so we've got to just go with economy of force. That, in defense of the Obama administration, what would you say?
So,
I don't buy it. I just don't buy it.
but it was
The
brilliantly
fact is- but
articulated.
yes. Look, the fact is that we are in Afghanistan, the longest war in our history, and there's not a great American clamoring to pull everything out of Afghanistan. There rightly was an American desire to see us reduce the costs in terms of lives and in treasure. That's been accomplished, but there's a recognition that we went to Afghanistan for a reason. That was because the 9/11 attacks were planned and the initial training was conducted there, and to ensure that it's never again a sanctuary for Al-Qaeda or other transnational extremists. We've accomplished that mission so far. It appears that we could continue to accomplish it with a relatively modest continuation. And again, I don't see the domestic politics that are demanding that kind. And this is not 165,000 American troops or zero. It's a modest addition to what it is we're doing now that is actually, in some respects, is working. In other respects, clearly needs to be augmented.
And I'd go one step further. So, look, there was not exactly a real surge of enthusiasm when President Bush announced the surge in Iraq. Sometimes presidents have to lead and persuade the country that we need to do something. We may not want to do it, but we have to do it. And so I think I'm with you, I don't buy it.
Bernie, your view.
Can I just add? I mean, I think your characterization is accurate as to, I believe, how President Obama views the American public and its appetite for this. But why then put so much energy and effort into Iran? It seems that's also the Middle East, and that's also a lot of some capital, political capital, symbolic capital. It seems to me that if you really want to back off the Middle East, then you should be an equal opportunity back offer, you know, and not have anything to do with Iran either.
Tom Friedman.
General Petraeus, this is for you. There's been a lot of talk in the panel here about retaliation, the need to retaliate in the event of aggressive behavior by Iran. I want to take you back to the Iraq War, because someone alluded to this. Iran, we know, built and designed the shape charges that killed more of your troops probably than any other weapon in that war. I
would not overstate that.
Okay, well, that killed
they killed hundreds and hundreds of our troops.
Killed-
IEDs killed thousands,
Right.
but,
So
but
you-
it was
you-
horrific.
horrific.
Could penetrate
So
any armor. Yep.
Iran developed weapons that penetrated armor that killed hundreds of our troops under your command. You were there with a large military force. You gave press conferences, as I recall, saying these shaped charges were developed and built in Iranian factories by Iran. Why didn't you retaliate against those factories or bases in Iran when you were there with hundreds of thousands of men, military equipment? You went after their people in Iraq, I know that, but
Very
why did we not then?
effectively.
Why
Yep.
did we not
Yep.
then go after where everyone's talking about retaliation? We were there. We had the troops. You saw the threat. They killed your men. Why did you not retaliate against their bases in Iran?
Because the national policy decision was not to escalate it further, obviously. Now, having said that, that's not to say that there were no actions taken on the other side of the border without getting into specifics. It's certainly not to say, it is certainly not to say that we did not defeat the Iranian-supported Shia militia extremists in Iraq, which we did. A little bit earlier than we'd planned to do it, when Prime Minister Maliki impulsively decided to send 2 Iraqi divisions on the spur of the moment into the Battle of Basra, which he almost lost and we retrieved, but then took advantage of that to defeat them everywhere in the country. And so not only did our forces during the surge defeat al-Qaeda in Iraq and the associated Sunni insurgents, we then turned, and this was deliberate, to focus first on the Sunni insurgents, then on the Shia militias. We did it a little earlier than we'd planned to do it, but did that and did defeat them there. And there were even communications with individuals like the Quds Force commander that if another one of these unspecified actions takes place, there will be repercussions. And in fact, there was nothing of one of those types for something like a year and a half after we communicated that to him. So but we didn't fly F-16s into Iranian airspace and put precision munitions into what we thought perhaps were camps in which this training was taking place. Or we were worried about the escalation and it getting out of control. Sure, exactly, yep.
So we have time for one more.
I assume, again, it's one to ask folks who are sitting at the Situation Room table, I guess.
We have time for one more question. And what I'd like to do is ask my friend Ayaan Hirsi Ali to ask the question, and then allow each of our panelists to respond, or just to respond to anything else you wanted to say to this audience before we have to close in about 5 or 6 minutes' time. Ayaan.
Thanks, Nick. The Marshall Plan was mentioned, and I think it was a great plan. But remember, in 1945, we won, and we won decisively, and we defeated the Germans and their allies and the Japanese, not only militarily, but on the battlefield of ideas. So in order for a Marshall Plan today, for that region to succeed in a comprehensive plan, as General Petraeus keeps talking about, let's get it comprehensive, we also have to tackle the battle of ideas. Okay. And this is a specific question for you, Bernard, which is, you've told us now about Iran, a bad actor, the regime, not the people, but the regime. We despise it, but we're willing to make a deal with them. Can you please tell us a little bit about the other bad actor? In my view, in fact, much more evil, but is our ally and has been our ally for a good long time, Wahhabi Saudi Arabia. You described Iran. You described the Iranian Supreme Guide as a caliph of sorts, but 85% of Muslims are Sunni. And with the oil money that Saudi Arabia yielded over the last 3 or 4 decades, they've used it to promote that narrow form of radical Islam. Please tell us a little bit more about that. And then to Francis and to General Petraeus, how on earth can this country be our ally? Why are we not as open about Saudi Arabia as we are open about the evil regime of the Islamic Republic
So-
of Iran.
All of these people will be with us this weekend to debate all these issues. Bernie, you get the first. This is the last round. Your last thoughts, Ayan's questions.
Okay. First, before, I want to just say that the Russians and Chinese are not on board with the model. Absolutely not, as you can see from the countries they're backing, including Syria. And then, you know, the analogy with Germany and Japan doesn't hold because Germany and Japan, even though defeated, had institutions. We don't have institutions in the region. So there's a slight, you know, difference there. Now let me turn to Saudi Arabia. Okay, so look, the relationship of Saudi Arabia with the United States is a complicated one. And it's centered on two poles, basically. On the one hand, the most obvious one is oil. Saudi Arabia is a responsible purveyor or steward of its oil wealth. Okay, last month it produced 10.6 million barrels of oil. That's a huge amount of oil. And it doesn't use it as a weapon. That is a very valuable thing for the West and for Western economies. And that is part of the fundamental deal that President Delano Roosevelt made with King Abdulaziz. That basically, you will supply us and we won't intervene in your domestic setup and how you culturally interpret Islam and so on. So that's one bit of your answer. The second pole is communism and the Cold War. And that's something that we cannot forget, which is that the Saudis used religion very effectively in defeating socialism and communism in the Third World, in the Arab world, and many other parts of the world. Even in Italy, the Saudis were subsidizing right-wing publications. That other bit of the story is an important one. In order to fight communism, they spread their form of Islam. And that form of Islam has led to the kinds of extremism that we see, but it's a necessary, not sufficient explanation for why we see this Salafism spread. I think there's something in the wider Muslim world, beyond Saudi money and Saudi proselytism, that Muslims, some Muslims, many Muslims, find appealing in Salafism. And it's because Salafism has this Protestant way of engaging with texts of revelation. People they don't want hierarchy, they don't want old authority structures to explain to them what Islam is. They want to turn to the text themselves. There's this question of immediacy, of authority that's built into Salafism that is widely appealing to people who are products of mass literacy today throughout the Arab and Muslim world. So it's not just that the Saudis have been bad guys in this respect, they have been, but there's something more to the story.
You're going to let me go first on this, are you? So let me pick up on what Bernard was saying. I do think, look, Salafism as a very sort of rigid form of reasoning in the Muslim world existed for decades when we didn't suffer this. And you have to appreciate that to appreciate what Bernard is saying. And so when I came to the relationship, context is important. I was sent in 2003 on the heels of the 9/11 Commission report that had 32 classified pages related to Saudi Arabia. There was the debate whether these classified pages would be declassified. And there was something of a chill in the relationship because the Bush administration refused to declassify it. And I went over, I was sent as the president's envoy. I want you to imagine, having never been there, a woman, Catholic, I was not exactly setting myself up for success here. But Nick will appreciate, I learned everything in third grade math that I needed to know about diplomacy, and when you learn the Venn diagram, I figured if I could find something that we had in common. And the answer was in 2003, after the real attack there, they understood that the snake in their backyard was biting them, and it was a threat to the stability of the regime. And so you began to realize there were places where we could cooperate. They didn't want money funding from inside the kingdom, funding terrorism that was going to happen in the kingdom. And so that's where we started. And then we began, once we had a wedge, we pushed it out. I use that as an example to say to you, We cooperate with them very tactically, and they are very effective tactical allies. So in terror finance, it was very useful. Did they change their textbooks? No. Did I raise that with them? Yes. Are they offensive? Do they say awful things about Christians and Jews? Yes. But we were able to get their cooperation against, on the terror finance side, tactically. We were able to do it in the intelligence world and build their capability. We get as much intelligence lead information on terrorism from them as we get from our British allies. Most people don't realize that. And we get the same sort of tactical military cooperation. And so while there are many things we disagree with them about, the things on which, at a tactical level, that we can work with them on and agree with them on are so overwhelmingly important to us that it's worth those things we disagree about.
Yeah, I'd strongly agree with that. First, let me just say, Nick, thanks for moderating yet another great one in this terrific tent, and for Fran. And really a privilege and a joy to be with Fran and Bernie. First, one just slight technical correction. Saudi Arabia is not an ally. It is a partner. We don't have an alliance with them. We do obviously have a partnership. And frankly, particularly since not 9/11, but really 2003, when they sustained these significant al-Qaeda attacks in their homeland, they've actually been very, very good partners in the intelligence world, in particular, in their law enforcement world, against al-Qaeda, and not just there, but elsewhere. They did crack down, this mythology that they allow people to send money to extremists around the world is just not accurate. When I gave them a number of an account, it was shut down. The challenge is just that there's a lot of ways of getting money to bad actors in the Middle East and indeed in other areas as well. They were also good, frankly, at helping counter instability in the region. Now, you may not like some of the stability, but I think as we look back now in the wake of the Arab Spring, stability has something to commend it. And so it's, how do you... I got it that some of that stability was achieved by people that carried out autocratic actions and all the rest of this, but as you know, it's this challenge of how do you balance stability and, again, some system that might be more to our particular liking. And certainly, of course, they're fueling the world with energy, but yes, they did have at times fueled certain aspects of radicalism around there. So again, to come back to what Bernie started off by saying, it's complicated, I think captures the reality there.
I mean, if I just add, we
Sure.
do not want Iran to be producing 10.6 million barrels of oil. They would use it in very different ways.
Exactly right. And by the way, Saudis have also been great partners at countering some of Iran's nefarious actions in the region, needless to say. Let me just have a final point, though, since you offer that opportunity to us. And I think if you really sort of came up to strategic level and what we've been discussing here, I think you would conclude that it is imperative that America exercise leadership in the Middle East and indeed in the world. There is no substitute. The indispensable nation, the term coined by the great Secretary of State in the front row there, may be one that we don't want to use quite as much because of whatever, but it's accurate. And it is especially so out in that region. We tried, I think, in reaction to the enormous commitments that we made and the huge cost and frustration and bloodshed and everything else to reduce what we did. I think the pendulum is actually swinging back the other way now a bit as we recognize that there is no substitute for U.S. leadership, and we have to provide it.
Amen. Thank you, General. David Petraeus, Fran Townsend, Bernie Haykel, thank you very much.